The contract was white, too bright against the dark mahogany of our father's dining table. My brother, Vin, didn't look at me as he pushed it forward. He was focused on his watch, a heavy gold piece that caught the late afternoon sun, as if the timing of this betrayal needed to be precise. My sister, Han, sat next to him. Her fingers traced the rim of a porcelain teacup she hadn't bothered to fill. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the humidity before a monsoon. Vin finally spoke. His voice was clipped and professional, the tone he used for boardrooms, not for the home where he'd learned to walk. He used the words market value and optimal timing. He talked about liquidating assets as if our mother wasn't sleeping in the next room, her breath thin and rhythmic, surrounded by the scent of the herbal patches I applied to her back every night. He said we needed to sell the apartment now while the district was still peaking. He looked at me then, expecting a nod, a tear, or a scream. He got none of them. I felt the pulse in my throat, a hard, rhythmic drumming that felt like it might bruise my skin from the inside. My palms were damp against the cool wood of the chair. I gripped the underside of the table, my fingernails digging into the grain to keep my hands from shaking. I didn't want them to see the tremor. On the outside, I was a statue. I was the dutiful, quiet sister they had known for 3 decades. The one who had stayed. The one who had traded a career in the city for the smell of disinfectant and the sound of a blood pressure monitor. Through the open window, the sound of a motorbike engine backfiring echoed from the street below, followed by the distant, melodic call of a street vendor selling steamed buns. The smells of the city drifted in: exhaust, jasmine, and the salt of the nearby river. Inside, the apartment smelled of old books and the faint, lingering aroma of the ginger tea I'd made for Mom an hour ago. Vin tapped the paper. The sound was sharp. It was a command. I am Lien. I am 34 years old. In this family, 34 is the age where you are expected to have a husband, a mortgage, and a seat at the adult table. Instead, I am the extra chair. I am the daughter who stayed behind to care for a mother who sometimes forgets my name, but never forgets how much she loves Vin. For years, I believed that my presence here was a choice made out of love. I believed that by giving up my youth to this 4-bedroom apartment in the heart of the city, I was earning a place of respect. I was wrong. To my siblings, I wasn't a caregiver. I was a placeholder. I was a live-in ghost guarding an asset they were finally ready to cash in. My brother looked at me with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. He told me that they had already found a buyer. He said that since I was the one living here, I should be the one to help Mom sign the papers. He said it would be easier if it came from me. They thought this was the end of the story. They thought I would simply pack my bags, find a small rental in a cheaper district, and fade away into the background of their successful lives. They saw my silence as a white flag. They didn't realize that silence can also be a mask. For the last 6 months, I hadn't just been measuring out heart medication and pureeing vegetables. I had been reading. I had been visiting offices they didn't know existed. I had been talking to people who didn't care about our family's reputation. Vin leaned back, crossing his legs, his expensive leather shoes polished to a mirror finish. He told me that I'd have a few weeks to find a new place. He even offered to help with the deposit. He spoke as if he were being generous. He had no idea that the chair he was sitting in didn't belong to the person he thought it did. I need to pause here for a second. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the person in your family who does everything right, only to be treated like you're invisible? Have you ever realized that the people you were protecting were the ones you actually needed protection from? I'm curious if anyone else has looked at their siblings and realized they weren't looking at family, but at debt collectors. If you've ever felt like a stranger in the home you built with your own sacrifices, I'd like to hear where you're listening from. It helps to know I'm not the only one who has had to learn how to fight in the dark. The air in the dining room felt thinner as Vin reached for his silver fountain pen. He held it out to me. He wanted me to take it into the bedroom and put it in our mother's hand. He wanted me to be the architect of my own displacement. My sister, Han, finally looked up from her empty cup. She told me to be realistic. She said that Mom's medical bills were only going to get higher and that this was the only way to ensure she had the best care. It was a lie. I knew the balance of Mom's savings account. I knew because I was the one who managed it. I also knew about Vin's failing construction firm and Han's mounting credit card debt from her failed boutique in the mall. They weren't selling the apartment for Mom. They were selling it to keep their own lives from crumbling. I looked at the pen. I looked at the contract. Then I looked at the hallway leading to the back of the apartment. I remembered the day our father died 10 years ago. It was a Tuesday. The rain had been relentless, drumming against these same windows. We had sat in this exact room, the three of us, while the lawyers read a will that seemed straightforward at the time. Back then, Vin was the golden son, the one who was supposed to carry the family name to new heights. Han was the beautiful one, the one who would marry into another powerful family. And I was just Lien. I was the quiet one. I was 24, just starting a job at a design firm, full of dreams about seeing the world. But as the funeral flowers wilted and the relatives went home, the reality of Mom's early-onset dementia began to settle into the floorboards. Vin was too busy. Han was too sensitive. So I stayed. I told myself it would only be for a year. That year became 10. 10 years of watching the city change through the window while the walls of this apartment became my entire world. I gave them a decade. They were giving me 30 days. I didn't take the pen. Instead, I stood up and walked to the kitchen to put on a fresh kettle of water. The war hadn't started yet, but I had already chosen my battlefield. The steam from the kettle hit my face, a damp heat that felt more honest than the cold draft coming from the dining room. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the ceramic tea set that had belonged to our grandmother. It was a delicate blue and white pattern, the kind of porcelain that feels like it might shatter if you breathe on it too hard. My breathing was jagged. I forced myself to count to 4, inhaling the scent of the dried oolong leaves I'd just measured out. I could hear the low murmur of Vin and Han's voices in the other room, a rhythmic hum of conspiracy that they didn't even try to hide. They were discussing numbers now, millions of dong being carved up like a Sunday roast. They didn't hear me. They never did. Han's heels clicked on the tile floor behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew the sound of her walk, impatient, sharp, and always moving toward something she wanted. She stood in the doorway, the scent of her expensive French perfume clashing with the earthy smell of the tea. She told me that I was being difficult for no reason. She said that this was the best thing for everyone, especially for me. She actually used the word freedom. She said that once the apartment was sold, I wouldn't have to be a nurse anymore and I could finally start my own life. It was a performance of sisterly concern that made my skin crawl. I turned slowly, the teapot heavy in my hand. I looked at her perfectly manicured nails and the way she adjusted her silk scarf. A memory hit me then, sharp as a physical blow. It was 3 years ago, the night Mom had her first major stroke. I had called Han 6 times, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone, while I waited for the ambulance in the pouring rain. When she finally answered, she told me she couldn't come because she had a gala for her boutique and her absence would be bad for business. She told me to call her in the morning with an update. I spent that night in a plastic chair in the emergency room, watching the fluorescent lights flicker while Mom's life hung by a thread. Han didn't show up until 2 days later, bringing a bouquet of lilies that Mom was allergic to. She forgot. I poured the tea. The golden liquid swirled into the cups, steady and clear. I told Han that freedom wasn't a word she got to use for me. I said it quietly, my voice level, but I saw her blink in surprise. She wasn't used to me pushing back. Usually, I just nodded and did what was expected. I was the reliable one. I was the safe one. I walked past her into the dining room, carrying the tray. Vin was looking at his phone, his thumb scrolling rapidly through a spreadsheet. He didn't look up when I set the tea down. He just reached for a cup without saying thank you. I sat back down in my chair. The contract was still there, a white ghost haunting the table. Vin finally looked up, his eyes narrow. He asked if I'd had enough time to process everything. He said the buyers were coming by tomorrow to do a final walkthrough and that I should make sure the place looked presentable. He spoke as if I were the maid, not the person who had maintained the value of his inheritance for a decade. He told me he'd already drafted a letter for me to sign, stating that I would vacate the premises within 30 days of the closing date. He pushed a second piece of paper toward me. I didn't even look at it. My mind was back in that hospital hallway, the smell of floor wax and the sound of a heart monitor. I remembered the bills that started piling up afterward. Vin had promised to cover the specialist in Singapore. He had promised to handle the renovation of the bathroom to make it wheelchair accessible. But every time the invoice came due, he had an excuse. His capital was tied up. The market was down. He had told me to just use Mom's pension and that he would pay me back later. He never did. I ended up selling my car and using my entire savings to keep this roof over Mom's head. They didn't know that. They didn't care to ask. I looked at Vin. I told him that I wouldn't be signing the letter. The silence that followed was absolute. Han let out a short, sharp laugh, as if I'd told a joke she didn't quite get. Vin's face didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten. He asked me what I meant. I picked up my teacup and took a slow, deliberate sip. The tea was hot, almost scalding, but I welcomed the burn. I told him that the apartment wasn't going to be sold tomorrow. I told him that the walkthrough was cancelled. He laughed then, a cold, condescending sound. He told me that I didn't have a choice. He reminded me that the title was in Mom's name and that he and Han held the power of attorney. He said that legally, I was just a guest. He was so confident. He was so sure of his own power that he hadn't bothered to check the fine print of the documents our father had left behind. He hadn't bothered to look at the debt obligations attached to this property. He thought I was weak. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It was the kind of peace you feel when you finally step into the eye of a storm. I looked at my brother and my sister, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the younger, lesser sibling. I felt like the only adult in the room. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't the contract they wanted. It was a receipt of a lien I had placed on the property 3 months ago for the unpaid medical expenses and home improvements I had funded entirely on my own. It was a legal anchor. They couldn't sell a single brick of this building until I was paid back in full, with interest. Vin reached for the paper, his hand trembling slightly now. He scanned the lines, his face turning a dull, angry red. He looked at the numbers, the dates, and the official stamp from the district office. He looked at me, and I saw the moment the realization hit him. I wasn't the placeholder anymore. I was the obstacle. He started to say something, his voice rising for the first time, but I held up my hand. I told him to lower his voice. I reminded him that Mom was sleeping. I told him that if he woke her up, I would call the police and have him removed for trespassing. I had spent years being the one who smoothed things over. I had been the one who apologized for things I didn't do just to keep the peace. I had been the one who shrank so they could feel big. No more. I watched Han's face go pale as she realized that her share of the sale was evaporating. She started to cry, but it wasn't out of sadness. It was out of frustration. It was the cry of a child who had been told no for the first time. I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt nothing at all. The sun was starting to set, casting long, orange shadows across the room. The apartment felt different now. It felt like mine. I told Vin and Han that they should leave. I told them that we could discuss the repayment plan through my lawyer starting Monday. Vin stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He called me ungrateful. He said I was destroying the family. He said I was stealing from him. I didn't flinch. I stood up too, mirroring his posture. I told him that the only person who had been stolen from was the woman in the next room who had worked her whole life to give him everything. I told him that I was simply collecting the debt he owed her. He looked like he wanted to strike me, but he saw the look in my eyes. He saw that I was done being afraid. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed toward the door. Han followed him, her heels echoing like a retreat. I stood in the center of the dining room as the front door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the hallway, a final, definitive period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I stayed there for a long time, listening to the silence return. It was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a victim. It was the quiet of a victor. I walked to the kitchen and began to wash the tea set. I moved slowly, carefully, making sure each piece was clean and dry before I put it back in the cupboard. My heart was still racing, a frantic bird trapped in my chest. I sat down at the small kitchen table where I usually ate my meals alone. I thought about the next few months. I knew this was just the beginning. I knew Vin would hire his own lawyers. I knew Han would call our aunts and uncles and tell them that I had lost my mind. I knew the rumors would start by morning. But for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't worried about what people would say. I was only worried about what I would do next. I looked at my hands. They were steady now. I remembered a day from my childhood, long before the illness and the bitterness took hold. We had been at the beach, and I had built a sandcastle. Vin had come by and kicked it over, laughing as the walls crumbled. I had cried then. I had run to Mom, and she had told me that if I wanted something to last, I had to build it out of something stronger than sand. She had been right. It had taken me 30 years to realize that the strongest thing in this house wasn't the walls or the furniture. It was the woman who had stayed behind to keep it all together. I went to the bedroom door and cracked it open. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the nightlight. Mom was still asleep, her gray hair spread out across the pillow like silk. She looked peaceful. She didn't know that the world outside this room had just changed. She didn't know that the son she adored had tried to sell the roof over her head. I walked over and adjusted the blanket, tucking it gently around her shoulders. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open for a brief second. She looked at me, and for a moment, the fog seemed to clear. She smiled and whispered my name. I felt a lump in my throat. I squeezed her hand and told her to go back to sleep. I told her that everything was going to be fine. I told her that I wasn't going anywhere. I sat by her bed until her breathing leveled out again. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for an apartment. I was fighting for the right to exist on my own terms. I was fighting for the 10 years I had given up and the 40 years I still had left. I walked back into the living room and looked out at the city. The lights were beginning to twinkle, thousands of tiny stars reflected in the glass of the skyscrapers. People were eating dinner, watching television, and living their lives, unaware of the small war that had just been fought in this fourth-floor apartment. I felt a strange sense of excitement. For the first time, I wasn't just a character in someone else's story. I was the author. I picked up the contract Vin had left on the table and tore it into a dozen pieces. I watched the white scraps fall into the wastebasket like snow. The war was far from over. But I had won the first battle. And I was just getting started. The morning light was a pale, sickly yellow as it filtered through the thin curtains of the living room. I hadn't slept. I had spent the night in the armchair by the window, watching the city lights flicker out one by one, replaced by the gray smudge of dawn. The silence in the apartment was different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a house under siege, but the vibrating, tense quiet of a fortress between attacks. My neck was stiff, and a dull ache throbbed behind my left eye, a physical reminder of the adrenaline that had sustained me through the evening. I watched a single ant crawl across the mahogany table, tracing the edge of where the contract had been. It was looking for something that wasn't there. Just like my siblings, I stood up and walked to the kitchen, my movements mechanical and practiced. The floorboards creaked under my weight, a familiar language I had learned to navigate in the dark without waking anyone. I filled the kettle. The sound of the running water was deafening in the stillness. I thought about the legal ownership clause my lawyer had pointed out 3 months ago, hidden deep within the transfer documents my father had signed shortly before his passing. Vin and Han had never read the full stack. They had only looked for their names and the percentages of the inheritance. They hadn't seen the condition that granted me lifetime tenancy protection as long as I remained the primary caregiver for our mother. They hadn't seen the clause that stipulated the property could not be sold without the unanimous consent of all resident heirs. They had assumed my residence was a courtesy they extended to me. They were wrong. The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the fog in my head. I turned it off quickly. I didn't want the noise to startle Mom. I prepared her breakfast, rice congee with a little bit of minced pork and ginger, the only thing she could consistently digest. As I stirred the pot, the smell of the ginger triggered a memory of the day Vin bought his first luxury car. I was 26 and Mom's condition had just started to deteriorate. I had asked Vin if he could contribute a few $100s a month so we could hire a part-time nurse, someone to help me lift her into the bath. He had laughed, leaning against the hood of his shiny new German sedan, and told me that he was reinvesting his capital for the good of the family's future. He told me that since I didn't have a real job, it made more sense for me to do it. He called me the heart of the home. It was a compliment designed to keep me in a cage. I carried the tray into Mom's room. She was awake, sitting up against the pillows, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall where a family photo used to hang before the frame broke. She looked small. The silk pajamas I'd bought her hung loosely on her frame, the vibrant floral pattern mocked by the sallow color of her skin. I sat on the edge of the bed and blew on a spoonful of congee. She took it obediently, like a child. I watched her swallow, the muscles in her throat working hard. This was the woman who had once managed a textile factory with 300 employees. This was the woman who had taught me how to balance a ledger before I could ride a bike. Now, she was a secret I had to protect from her own children. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a text from Han. She didn't lead with an apology or a question. She sent a screenshot of a legal notice, claiming they were going to challenge my lien in court. She added a message saying that I was being selfish and that Mom deserved a better environment than a dusty old apartment. The hypocrisy was a bitter taste in my mouth. Han hadn't visited this dusty old apartment in 4 months, not even for Mom's birthday. She had sent a cake via a delivery app and a card she hadn't even signed herself. I felt the familiar heat of anger rising, but I pushed it down. I needed to stay cold. I needed to stay precise. I went back to the living room and sat at my father's desk. It was a heavy piece of furniture, filled with the ghosts of his business deals and the scent of his old pipe tobacco. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the blue folder I had been assembling. Inside were the receipts for every cent I had spent on this house. New plumbing, rewiring, the medical-grade air purifier, the hospital bed, every repair that Vin and Han had refused to fund. The total was staggering. It wasn't just a list of expenses, it was a record of their abandonment. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I looked at the numbers. They thought they were the ones with the financial leverage. They didn't realize that I had been keeping a much more accurate book than they ever could. The doorbell rang at 10 in the morning. It wasn't the sharp, aggressive ring of Vin or the frantic buzzing of Han. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse. I looked through the peephole. It was Auntie Mai, our mother's younger sister. She was the family gossip, the woman who knew everyone's business from the market to the temple. I knew why she was here. Vin had made his first move. He was sending in the social pressure. He was trying to shame me into submission. I opened the door. Auntie Mai walked in without being asked, her eyes darting around the room as if she were looking for signs of neglect. She carried a bag of oranges and a heavy cloud of incense. She sat on the sofa and sighed, a long, theatrical sound. She told me she had heard the most troubling things. She said that Vin and Han were worried about my mental state. She used the word burdened. She suggested that perhaps the stress of caring for Mom was making me see enemies where there were none. She talked about the importance of filial piety and the shame of a family fighting over money. She didn't mention the lien. She didn't mention the fact that Vin was planning to put Mom in a state-run facility once the sale was finalized. I let her talk. I stood by the window, watching a stray dog trot across the street below. I didn't interrupt her, even when she started talking about how hard Vin was working to provide for his own children. I waited until she had exhausted her scripted lecture. Then, I sat down across from her. I didn't offer her tea. I told her that if she was so concerned about the family's reputation, she should ask Vin why he hadn't paid his mother's medical insurance in 2 years. I asked her if she knew that Han had tried to take Mom's jewelry out of the safe while I was at the pharmacy last month. Auntie Mai's mouth snapped shut. She tried to stammer a defense, but I didn't give her the space. I told her that I had the records. I told her that I had the videos from the security camera I'd installed in the hallway, the one Vin and Han didn't know about. I told her that if anyone was going to be shamed in front of the extended family, it wasn't going to be me. I told her to go back to my brother and tell him that every time he tried to use a relative to pressure me, the price of my cooperation would double. I saw the fear in her eyes then. She realized that I wasn't the niece she could bully with platitudes. I was something else entirely. She left within 5 minutes, leaving the oranges on the table. They looked like bruised suns. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. It was a fleeting, hollow sensation in the center of my chest. I looked around the apartment, at the furniture that had been here since I was a child, and I realized how much I had sacrificed for these walls. I had no husband. I had no career of my own. My social circle had shrunk to the pharmacists and the nurses. I was 34, and my most significant relationship was with a woman who didn't always know who I was. I felt a moment of doubt. Was I fighting for the right reasons? Was I just being vindictive? Then I heard Mom call out from the bedroom. It was a soft, confused sound. I went to her. She was pointing at the window, at a bird perched on the ledge. She smiled, a genuine, beautiful smile that reached her eyes. She told me it looked just like the one her father used to have. For that 1 second, she was completely present. She was safe. She was home. The doubt vanished. I knew exactly why I was fighting. I was the only thing standing between this woman and a cold, clinical room in a facility where she would be a number instead of a person. I would burn every bridge. I had to keep her in this sunlight. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with my lawyer. He told me that Vin's threat to challenge the lien was mostly bluster. It would take months, if not years, to clear it through the courts, and by then, the buyer for the apartment would have moved on. The market was already starting to cooling down. Vin was desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. I told the lawyer to prepare a formal counteroffer. I didn't want to sell. I wanted to buy. I wanted to use the debt obligation reveal to force Vin and Han to sign over their remaining shares of the apartment in exchange for me not pursuing them for the decade of unpaid expenses and potential elder abuse charges. It was a bold move. It was a gamble. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. I stood on the balcony, the air starting to cool. I could see the lights of the city coming on again. I thought about the next few weeks. The legal battles. The family phone calls. The constant, gnawing anxiety. I knew it was going to get worse before it got better. I knew Vin wouldn't go down without a fight. He had too much to lose. But I had already lost everything that mattered to me years ago when I chose to stay. I had nothing left to fear. I was the ghost in the machine, and I was finally taking control of the gears. I went inside and closed the balcony door. I locked it. I locked the front door too, engaging the new deadbolt I'd had installed. I felt a sense of power in that simple action. I was the gatekeeper. I went to the kitchen and started to prepare dinner. I moved with a new sense of purpose. The knife sliced through the vegetables with a satisfying, rhythmic thud. I was no longer waiting for the storm to pass. I was the storm. And I was heading straight for them. The silence I left behind was sour, like milk turned in the sun. I walked through the apartment, my fingers trailing over the wallpaper in the hallway. It was a textured silk, expensive when it was installed 20 years ago, but now it was peeling at the corners, showing the gray concrete beneath. My father used to say that a house is a living thing and that it knows when its inhabitants are at war. I believed him. The walls felt tight today, as if the air pressure had changed. I sat at my father's desk again, the weight of the blue folder under my hand. I wasn't just holding papers. I was holding the history of every time my siblings had turned their backs on this family. I opened the ledger where I had meticulously tracked the cost of Mom's care. It wasn't just the large bills for the hospital or the physical therapist. It was the small things. The specialized bedsheets that didn't chafe her skin. The organic ginger I had to hunt for in the wet markets because the supermarket stuff didn't settle her stomach. The taxi fares for the checkups that Vin was always too busy to drive her to. I looked at a receipt from 5 years ago. It was for a repair on the air conditioning unit in Mom's room. It had broken in the middle of a July heat wave. I remembered calling Vin, begging him to help because my bank account was empty. He had told me he was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. I had spent that night fanning Mom with a piece of cardboard while she whimpered in her sleep. I ended up selling my grandmother's gold earrings the next morning to pay the repairman. Vin never asked how I fixed it. He just assumed things worked because they always did when I was around. The injustice of it didn't just hurt, it burned a clean, cold hole in my chest. I remembered the day I was supposed to leave for my internship in Singapore. I was 22, full of the kind of arrogance that only the young and talented possess. I had my suitcase packed. I had my visa. But that morning, Dad had his first collapse. Vin had looked at me over the hospital bed and told me that if I left, I was responsible for whatever happened next. He didn't offer to stay. He didn't offer to hire help. He just placed the weight of our father's life on my shoulders and walked out to take a business call. I stayed. I unpacked my suitcase and watched my dreams gather dust in the back of the closet. I gave up my future so he could build his. And now he wanted the house too. My phone chimed. It wasn't a text this time. It was an email from Vin's legal counsel. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. They weren't just challenging the lien. They were questioning my status as the primary caregiver. They were alleging that I had isolated Mom from the rest of the family to manipulate her finances. They were threatening to petition for a court-appointed guardian. It was a declaration of total war. They wanted to take Mom away from me so they could sell the floor she was standing on. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, trapped animal. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. I wouldn't let them. I called my lawyer, Mr. Tran. His voice was a calm, steady anchor in the storm. I told him about the email. I told him about the guardianship threat. He didn't sound surprised. He told me that this was a standard tactic for people who were losing. He asked me if I had the evidence we discussed. I looked at the bottom drawer of the desk, the one with the hidden compartment Dad had shown me when I was a child. Inside was a small, black USB drive. On it were the recordings from the hidden cameras in the living room and the hallway. I had installed them a year ago, not because I was paranoid, but because I wanted to see how Mom acted when I wasn't in the room. What I had captured instead was Vin and Han's visits. I remembered one video in particular. It was from 3 months ago. I had gone to the pharmacy, leaving Vin alone with Mom for 30 minutes. In the video, Mom was agitated, calling out for Dad. Vin didn't comfort her. He didn't even look at her. He stood by the window, talking loudly on his phone about the asset and how the old woman was holding up the deal. He had laughed when his business partner made a joke about nursing homes. At one point, Mom had reached out to touch his sleeve, and he had pulled away with a look of pure disgust, as if she were something contagious. I had watched that video once and then hidden it away. It was too painful to see the man I had once looked up to treat our mother like an inconvenience. But now, that video was my greatest weapon. I told Mr. Tran I had the footage. I also told him I had the bank statements showing that Vin had been skimming from Mom's secondary account for years, small amounts that he thought I wouldn't notice. $50 here, $100 there. It added up to thousands. It was a debt obligation reveal that would ruin his reputation in the city. In our culture, stealing from your own mother is a sin that can't be washed away. It's a social death sentence. I felt a momentary flick of hesitation. If I used this, there would be no going back. The family would be shattered beyond repair. I looked toward the hallway. Mom was awake. I could hear her humming a song I didn't recognize, a sweet, fragile melody that drifted through the air. She sounded happy. She sounded safe. The hesitation vanished. They had started this. They had looked at this home and seen only a dollar sign. They had looked at our mother and seen an obstacle. I wasn't destroying the family. I was performing an amputation to save the heart. I told Mr. Tran to move forward with the counteroffer. I didn't want to just block the sale. I wanted to force them to sign over their inheritance rights to the apartment immediately. I would use the evidence of the financial elder abuse as the leverage. If they signed, I wouldn't go to the police or the rest of the family. If they didn't, I would make sure every business associate Vin had and every socialite Han knew saw the videos. It was cold. It was calculated. It was exactly what they had taught me to be. The city outside was loud now, the midday rush in full swing. I could hear the sirens and the shouting of the street vendors, a chaotic symphony that felt perfectly aligned with the turbulence in my mind. I stood up and went to the kitchen. I needed to eat, but my stomach was a tight knot of nerves. I settled for a glass of water. As I drank, I looked at the calendar on the wall. It was marked with Mom's appointments, her medication schedule, and the dates for her hair appointments. My whole life was written in those small squares. For 10 years, I had been the silent spectator of my own life. I had been the one who waited. I went to Mom's room. She was sitting by the window, watching the traffic. She looked up and smiled at me. She asked me if Dad was coming home for dinner. My heart broke for the 1000th time. I took her hand and told her that Dad was away on business, but that I was here. She patted my cheek and told me I was a good girl. She said I reminded her of someone she used to know. I sat with her for a long time, watching the sun move across the floor. I wasn't just a caregiver. I was a guardian. I was the wall between the world and the woman who had given me life. Vin and Han thought they could break that wall with a contract and a few legal threats. They didn't understand that the wall wasn't made of bricks or paper. It was made of 10 years of sacrifice, of sleepless nights, and of a love that had been forged in the fire of their neglect. You don't walk away from a wall like that. You fight until there's nothing left. I left Mom in her chair and went back to the living room. I picked up the phone. It was time to make the call. I wasn't waiting for the morning. I wasn't waiting for another threat. I was taking the fight to them. I dialed Vin's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice full of the same arrogance he'd had at the dining table. He asked me if I was calling to apologize. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I spoke with the terrifying clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose. I told him I had just sent a file to his personal email. I told him he had 10 minutes to watch it before I sent it to his board of directors. I heard the silence on the other end of the line, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The power dynamic shifted in that single second. I could feel it through the phone, a physical weight transferring from his shoulders to mine. He didn't say a word. He hung up. I put the phone down on the mahogany table and waited. I watched the clock. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3. The city outside continued its frantic pace, but inside the apartment, time had stopped. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. I saw the girl who had stayed behind. I saw the woman who had fought back. And I realized that for the first time in 34 years, I wasn't afraid of the future. I was the future. The phone rang 10 minutes later. It wasn't Vin's lawyer. It was Vin. His voice was different now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. He asked me what I wanted. I told him the terms. I told him he had 24 hours to bring the signed documents to the apartment. I told him if he brought a lawyer, the deal was off. I told him if he told Han, the deal was off. I wanted them both in that room, facing me, without their shields. He tried to argue. He tried to tell me I was being unreasonable. I cut him off. I told him that unreasonable was trying to sell a house with your mother inside it. I told him that unreasonable was stealing from an old woman's bank account to pay for a country club membership. I told him I didn't want to hear his voice again until he was standing in front of me with a pen in his hand. I hung up before he could respond. I stood in the center of the living room, the silence returning like a slow-moving tide. I felt a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. My legs felt like lead. I sat down on the floor, my back against the silk wallpaper. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the house, the ginger, the old paper, the faint smell of jasmine from the balcony. It was the smell of my life. It was the smell of the battlefield. I wasn't done yet, but the lines were drawn. The first cracks were appearing in their perfect lives. I would be there to watch the whole structure crumble. I would be the one to pick up the pieces and build something new. Something that belonged only to me. And to the woman who still thought Dad was coming home for dinner. The war was moving into its final phase. I was ready. The 24 hours felt like a slow-motion descent into a dark canyon. I spent the night moving through the apartment, performing the same rituals I'd done for a decade, but every action felt heavy with the weight of what was coming. I checked the locks. I organized the medicine cabinet. I sat with Mom and listened to her talk about a rainstorm from 1985 as if it were happening right outside the window. I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest, a phantom limb where my family used to be. I wondered if I was becoming the monster Vin and Han already believed I was. I shook the thought away. Mercy is a luxury for those who haven't spent 10 years being bled dry. The afternoon sun was harsh, cutting across the living room in sharp, unforgiving lines. The doorbell rang at exactly 4 o'clock. I didn't rush to answer it. I let the sound echo through the hallway, a mechanical demand that I was no longer obligated to meet instantly. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. My face was a mask of practiced indifference. I looked like a woman who was simply waiting for the mail. I opened the door. Vin stood there alone. He looked smaller than he had 2 days ago. His expensive suit was wrinkled at the elbows, and there were dark, bruised circles under his eyes that no amount of privilege could hide. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, at the scuffed wooden threshold he had crossed 1,000 times without ever really seeing it. He walked in, his shoulders slumped, the briefcase in his hand looking like a lead weight. He didn't wait for me to invite him to sit. He went to the mahogany table and dropped the briefcase onto the surface with a dull thud. The silence between us was a physical barrier. I stood by the window, the light at my back, keeping him in the shadow. I asked where Han was. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving convulsively. He said she was in the car. He said she couldn't stop crying and that she refused to come up. He looked up at me then, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in my brother's eyes. It wasn't just fear of the video or the bank records. It was the fear of a man who realized the person he had been stepping on for 30 years was finally standing up. He opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. They were the ownership transfer papers, the inheritance waivers, and the formal resignation of his and Han's power of attorney. Everything I had demanded. He pushed them toward me, his hand shaking so violently the paper rattled against the wood. He told me he'd done it. He said he'd convinced Han that this was the only way to keep the family together. I almost laughed. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had reached its expiration date. I walked to the table and picked up the first page. I read every line. I looked for the traps, the loopholes, the clever phrasing he might have tried to slip past me. I found none. He was too broken to be clever. I looked at his signature, a jagged, desperate scrawl that looked nothing like the confident mark he put on his corporate contracts. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of him teaching me how to ride a bike on the sidewalk downstairs. He had held the back of the seat, promising he wouldn't let go. He had let go almost immediately, laughing as I wobbled and fell. I looked at the papers. This time, I was the one letting go. I told him he needed to call Han up. I told him I wouldn't accept her signature unless I saw her sign it in front of me. He started to protest, his voice cracking, but I just looked at him. I didn't have to say a word. The thread of the email was still hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. He pulled out his phone and made the call. 10 minutes later, Han entered the room. She looked like a ghost. Her makeup was ruined, and her silk blouse was stained with sweat. She didn't look at me once. She walked to the table, grabbed the pen from Vin's hand, and signed her name with a ferocity that tore the paper slightly. She looked at me then, her eyes red and full of a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. She called me a parasite. She said I had planned this from the moment Mom got sick. She said I was a cold-blooded bitch who had used our mother as a shield to steal their birthright. I felt the pulse in my neck jump. My palms were cold. I wanted to scream back at her, to list every night I'd spent cleaning up vomit while she was at a party. I wanted to tell her about the gold earrings I'd sold. I wanted to break her world the way she had broken mine. I didn't. I kept my voice steady, so quiet they had to lean in to hear me. I told her that the only thing I had stolen was the burden they didn't want. I told her that this apartment was no longer an asset. It was a sanctuary. I picked up the signed documents and tucked them into my folder. I told them they were free now. I told them they never had to come back here again. I told them they could go back to their lives and their debts and their illusions of success. I told them to leave. Vin stood up, his face ashen. He asked if I was really going to go through with it. He asked if I was going to send the files anyway. I looked at him for a long beat. I told him that I wasn't like him. I told him that I kept my promises. I told him the files would be deleted the moment they walked out the door and stayed out. He didn't thank me. He just grabbed his briefcase and moved toward the exit, his pace increasing as he got closer to the door. Han followed him, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the tile. The door shut. The lock clicked. I was alone. I stood in the center of the room, the silence rushing back in to fill the space they had occupied. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea. I ran to the bathroom and leaned over the sink, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked at my hands in the mirror. They were trembling. I wasn't a hero. I was a survivor who had just burned down her own house to keep the cold out. I walked back into the living room and sat on the floor. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket. I went to the laptop and opened the files. I saw the video of Vin talking on the phone. I saw the bank statements. I saw the evidence of their betrayal. I felt a momentary urge to keep it, to hold on to it like a weapon just in case. But I knew that if I kept it, I would never be free. I would always be the girl in the hallway, waiting for the blow to fall. I selected the folder. I hit delete. The screen flickered for a second, and then it was gone. The weight in my chest didn't disappear, but it shifted. It became something I could carry. I walked to Mom's room. She was asleep, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. She looked like a child. I sat on the floor by her bed and leaned my head against the mattress. I thought about the next 10 years. There would be no more fights about the mortgage. There would be no more letters from lawyers. It would just be us. I realized then that this wasn't the end of the war. It was just the end of the first chapter. I had won the house, but I had lost the family I thought I had. I was 34 years old, and I was starting over in the middle of the only world I'd ever known. I looked at the window. The sun was gone, replaced by the deep, bruised blue of twilight. The city was waking up, its millions of lights beginning to pulse. I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't a placeholder anymore. I was the owner. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a decade, I let myself fall into a sleep that didn't feel like a surrender. The first week of my new life was remarkably quiet. I woke up every morning at 6, before the city noise could drown out the sound of my own thoughts, and watched the light creep across the ceiling. There was no longer a knot of dread in my stomach when the phone vibrated. I had blocked Vin and Han's numbers, a simple click of a button that felt more significant than any legal document I had signed. I spent my days moving through the apartment with a sense of ownership that was still unfamiliar, like wearing a new pair of shoes that hadn't quite molded to my feet yet. I scrubbed the floors until they gleamed. I polished the mahogany table until I could see my own reflection in the grain. I was erasing them, one layer of dust at a time. I remember a specific afternoon when the quiet felt almost too heavy. I was in the kitchen, cutting up soft fruit for Mom's snack, when I found a small, plastic toy car wedged behind the refrigerator. It was a cheap thing, faded red plastic with one wheel missing. It had belonged to Vin. He must have lost it there 30 years ago. I held it in my hand, feeling the grit of decades-old dirt on my palm. For a split second, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the boy who used to share his candy with me. Then I remembered the look on his face as he pushed that contract toward me. I threw the car in the trash. It didn't belong here anymore. My bank account was no longer a source of panic. Without the constant drain of loans to my siblings or the mystery withdrawals from mom's accounts, the numbers actually began to grow. I hired a professional nurse, a woman named Hung who had kind eyes and strong hands, to come in for 4 hours every afternoon. For the first time in a decade, I was able to leave the apartment without a crushing sense of guilt. I walked through the parks. I visited the galleries. I sat in cafes and watched people who had no idea who I was. I felt like a deep-sea diver finally reaching the surface. The pressure was gone, but the city has a way of reminding you that you can't stay hidden forever. I was at the market, picking through a pile of dragon fruit, when I ran into a former business associate of my father's, a man named Mr. Gwyn. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity that made my skin prickle. He mentioned that he'd seen Vin at a dinner the night before and that my brother hadn't looked well. He said there were rumors that Vin's firm was facing an audit. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and asked if it was true that I had forced my siblings out of the family home. He used the word greed. I didn't flinch. I didn't try to explain the lien or the stolen money or the years of neglect. I simply smiled at him, the same polite, empty smile I had used for guests for years. I told him that every family has its own way of settling its debts. I told him that I was simply making sure our mother had the peace she deserved. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly realizing he wasn't going to get the gossip he wanted. I walked away before he could ask another question. I realized then that while I had won the battle for the apartment, the war for my reputation was just beginning. They were painting me as the villain. They were the victims of a sister's hidden malice. I felt a brief flicker of heat in my chest, a desire to set the record straight. I wanted to call every person they knew and play the videos. I wanted to show the world the bank statements. But as I walked home, the bag of fruit heavy against my leg, the anger faded. Let them talk. Let them build their stories out of smoke and mirrors. I had the bricks. I had the title deed. I had the woman who gave me life sleeping peacefully in the next room. Their words couldn't reach me here. When I got back to the apartment, Hung was reading to Mom in the living room. The afternoon sun was casting long, golden fingers across the floor, and the smell of jasmine tea was thick in the air. Mom looked up and smiled at me, a real, recognizing smile. She called me her brave girl. My throat tightened. I realized that in all the years of caring for her, I had never heard her say that. Maybe she had always known. Maybe she had been waiting for me to find my own strength. I went to the balcony and looked out at the skyline. The skyscrapers were beginning to glow with the orange light of the setting sun. I thought about the girl who had unpacked her suitcase 10 years ago, crying because she thought her life was over. I wanted to go back and tell her that it was just beginning. I wanted to tell her that the walls she felt trapped in would one day become her fortress. I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the struggle. It had stripped away everything that wasn't real. It had left me with a clear mind and a steady hand. I picked up my phone and saw a notification. It was a message from an unknown number, but I knew the cadence of the words. It was Han. She said that our aunt was sick and that it was my fault for causing so much stress. She said that if I had any heart left, I would reconsider the arrangement. She called me a traitor to our blood. I didn't feel the usual surge of anxiety. I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I simply deleted the message and blocked the number. I was done being the emotional trash can for their failures. I spent the evening sitting on the floor of the living room, sorting through a box of old photographs. I found a picture of the three of us as children, standing in front of this very apartment building. Vin had his arm around my shoulder. Han was holding my hand. We looked like a family. I looked at the photograph for a long time, trying to find the moment when the rot had started. Was it when Dad died? Or had it always been there, hidden under the layers of expectation and tradition? I didn't have an answer. I put the photo at the bottom of the stack. I stood up and walked to the window. The city was a sea of lights now, a restless, breathing thing. I felt a sense of calm that was almost frightening. I had everything I wanted, and yet I felt a strange emptiness. It wasn't the emptiness of loss, but the emptiness of a clean slate. I had spent so long fighting to keep what I had that I hadn't thought about what I wanted to build next. I realized that the apartment was just the beginning. I had a life to reclaim. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. I moved with a slow, deliberate grace. The kettle didn't feel heavy anymore. The floorboards didn't feel like a cage. I was 34 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I was the master of this small kingdom. I took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through my chest. The war was over. The silence was mine. And tomorrow, I would start deciding what to do with it. The stillness of the apartment had become my companion, but today it felt thin, like ice ready to crack. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same spot where Vin had tried to sign away my life, when I received a physical letter. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was a handwritten note from my mother's oldest brother, Uncle Hong, the patriarch of the family who lived in the countryside. He didn't use the sharp, corporate language of my brother or the hysterical accusations of my sister. He wrote about roots. He wrote about the duty of a daughter to maintain the harmony of the clan. He informed me that he would be arriving in the city tomorrow to mediate the situation. He didn't ask for permission. In our world, a man like him doesn't need to ask. I felt a cold sweat prickle along my hairline. My pulse, usually a steady rhythm since the victory, began to skip and flutter like a dying bird. I gripped the edge of the table until the wood bit into my palms. This was the final move. Vin had realized he couldn't beat me with laws, so he was reaching back into the past, pulling out the heavy, rusted chains of tradition. Uncle Hong represented a power that didn't care about liens or tenancy protection. He represented the judgment of the ancestors. I looked at the letter, the ink slightly blurred as if written in a hurry. The air in the room suddenly felt stagnant. I was being hunted by ghosts. I spent the afternoon preparing. I didn't clean the house or bake treats for his arrival. Instead, I went back to my father's desk. I dug deeper into the files, looking for things I had ignored when I was only focused on the apartment. I found a small leather-bound diary that had belonged to my father, hidden behind a false back in the drawer. I had seen it before but had never dared to open it, feeling like an intruder in his private thoughts. Now I had no choice. I read the entries from the final months of his life. My breath hitched. I found the record of a series of loans Dad had made to Uncle Hong to cover up a gambling scandal at the local village council. It was a massive sum. It was money that should have been part of our inheritance. The specific memory hit me then, sharp and bitter. I was 12 years old, and Uncle Hong had come to visit. He had sat in this very room, lecturing my father about the importance of being a man of honor and protecting the family name. He had looked at me with disdain because I was just a girl, a secondary thought in the grand lineage. My father had looked tired, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his brother's demands. I remembered seeing my father hand over a thick envelope, his hands trembling. Uncle Hong hadn't thanked him. He had simply tucked it into his jacket and complained that the tea was cold. The hypocrisy was a physical weight in the room. The next morning, the doorbell didn't ring. Uncle Hong used his own key, a copy I didn't know existed. He walked into the living room, leaning on a cane that he used more for theater than for support. Vin and Han were behind him, looking like chastened children. They didn't speak. They let the old man take the center of the room. He sat in my father's chair without being invited. He looked at me with eyes that were like two black stones. He told me that I had forgotten my place. He said that a house belongs to the sons, and that my defiance was a stain on my father's memory. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who has never been told no. I didn't offer him tea. I didn't bow. I stood by the balcony door, the city traffic humming a low, indifferent song behind me. I told him that the house belonged to the person who kept the roof from falling in. I told him that my father's memory was safe because I was the only one who stayed to protect it. His face darkened, a deep, angry red creeping up his neck. He raised his cane and pointed it at me. He told me that he would disown me from the family registry. He said I would be a woman without a name, a ghost walking the streets. It was the ultimate threat in our culture. He expected me to crumble. I reached into the folder on the table. I didn't pull out the lien or the ownership papers. I pulled out the leather-bound diary. I opened it to the page with the gambling debts and laid it on the table in front of him. I didn't say a word. I watched his eyes scan the lines. I watched the confidence drain out of his face, replaced by a gray, ashen terror. The room went silent. Even the sound of the motorbikes outside seemed to fade away. Vin and Han looked confused, glancing between the diary and their uncle. They didn't know. They hadn't been important enough for the secrets. I leaned forward, my voice a cold whisper that felt like a blade. I told him that if he spoke one more word about my place or my father's honor, I would take this diary to the village council. I told him I would make sure every elder in the province knew that the great patriarch was a thief who had bled his dying brother dry. I told him that the family registry was just a book, but the truth was a fire. I saw his hand shake as he touched the edge of the diary. He knew I would do it. He saw the 10 years of repressed rage in my eyes and realized he was outmatched. He stood up slowly. He didn't look at Vin. He didn't look at Han. He didn't even look at the diary. He turned and walked toward the door, his cane clicking feebly on the floorboards. He looked like an old man who had finally realized he was irrelevant. Vin tried to stop him, asking what was happening, but Uncle Hong pushed him aside without a word. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Vin and Han stood there, frozen. They had brought their nuclear weapon, and it had turned out to be a dud. I looked at my siblings. I felt a sudden, profound sense of pity. They were so small. They were so desperate for a piece of a world that was already dead. I told them to follow their uncle. I told them that the next time they tried to use the past against me, they should make sure their own hands were clean. Han started to say something, her lip trembling, but Vin grabbed her arm. He knew it was over. Truly over. They left together, their footsteps heavy and defeated in the hallway. I was alone again. I sat down in my father's chair. I felt a strange, vibrating energy in my limbs, the aftershock of the confrontation. I looked at the diary. I realized that my father hadn't left it for me to use as a weapon. He had left it as a confession. He had been a prisoner of his own family just as I had been. He had spent his life paying for the sins of others. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, the first one I had allowed myself in years. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release. I was finally carrying the truth instead of the burden. I went to the kitchen and filled a glass of water. My hands were perfectly still. I looked out at the city, the skyscrapers reflecting the midday sun like shards of glass. I thought about the family registry. I thought about the ancestors. I realized that honor isn't something you inherit. It's something you build in the quiet hours when no one is watching. It's the way you treat a person who can do nothing for you. I walked to Mom's room. She was awake, looking at a magazine. She looked up and told me that the room felt lighter. I smiled. I told her the ghosts had finally left. I spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet reflection. The apartment felt different. The walls felt wider. The air felt cleaner. I had dismantled the last of the old world. I had stood up to the patriarch and won. But more importantly, I had looked at the past and refused to let it dictate my future. I was no longer the daughter who stayed. I was the woman who remained. I picked up the phone and called a travel agency. I asked about tickets to Singapore. I wasn't going for an internship this time. I was going for a vacation. Just for a week. Hung would stay with Mom. The world was waiting. And I finally had the key. The suitcase sat open on my bed, a hollow shell waiting to be filled. I moved through the room, selecting clothes I hadn't worn in years, a silk dress I'd bought for a wedding I never attended, a pair of leather sandals still smelling of the shop in District 1. Each item felt like a message from a woman I used to know. I felt a flutter in my stomach, a nervous, electric energy that made my fingertips tingle. It wasn't the cold anxiety of the last few months. It was something else. It was anticipation. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. The car would be here in an hour. I walked into the living room one last time before leaving. The morning sun was soft, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The apartment was quiet, but it was a peaceful silence, the kind that follows a long, cleansing rain. Hong was already in the kitchen, preparing the mid-morning tea. She looked up and gave me a reassuring nod. She had promised to video call me every night, to show me Mom's face and let me hear her voice. I knew they would be fine. I had reinforced the locks, updated the security system, and left a detailed binder of emergency contacts on the counter. The fortress was secure. I stepped onto the balcony. The city was laid out before me, a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece of concrete and light. I looked down at the street where the motorbikes swarmed like schools of fish. For 10 years, I had looked at this view and felt like a prisoner watching the world from behind bars. Today, the horizon looked different. It looked open. I realized that my siblings were still down there somewhere, caught in the gears of the very machines they had tried to use against me. They were still chasing the numbers and the status and the shadows of our father's approval. I was the only one who had truly escaped. A memory drifted to the surface, unbidden. It was the day of my university graduation. My father had been so proud, standing there in his best suit, telling everyone that I was the jewel of the family. He had whispered in my ear that I had a strength the others didn't have the strength to endure. At the time, I had taken it as a compliment. Later, I had resented it, feeling like he had cursed me to be the one who always carried the weight. But standing here now, I finally understood what he meant. Enduring isn't just about surviving. It's about outlasting the storm until you are the only thing left standing. I heard the muffled sound of a car horn from the street. It was time. I went to Mom's room to say goodbye. She was sitting in her favorite chair, her hands folded in her lap. I knelt beside her and took her hands. They were thin and dry, like old parchment. I told her I was going away for a little while, but that I'd be back soon. She looked at me, her eyes clear and focused for a rare, beautiful moment. She didn't ask where I was going. She didn't ask about Vin or Han. She just reached out and tucked a stray hair behind my ear. She told me to fly high. I felt a lump in my throat that I didn't try to swallow. I kissed her forehead and stood up. I walked through the hallway, past the peeling silk wallpaper and the mahogany table that had seen so much betrayal. I didn't look back. I picked up my suitcase and my handbag, feeling the weight of the keys in my pocket. They were heavy. They were real. I opened the front door and stepped out into the corridor. The air in the stairwell was cool and smelled of incense from a neighbor's altar. I pulled the door shut behind me, the lock engaged with a sharp, definitive click. The sound echoed through the hallway, a final note in a long, difficult symphony. I walked toward the elevator, my heels striking the floor with a steady, confident rhythm. I felt a strange sense of weightlessness, as if the apartment and all its ghosts had stayed behind the door. I was 34 years old, and I was finally stepping into the sunlight. I wasn't just Lien, the daughter who stayed. I was Lien, the woman who survived. I pushed the button for the ground floor and waited. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. As the car descended, I looked at my reflection in the polished metal of the doors. I saw a woman with a calm face and steady eyes. I saw a woman who knew the value of her own life. The doors opened to the lobby, and the heat of the city hit me immediately, a thick, vibrant wall of humidity and noise. I walked across the marble floor and out into the street. The car was waiting at the curb. The driver took my bag, and I climbed into the backseat. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked up at the 4th floor. The balcony was empty, the jasmine plants swaying slightly in the breeze. I felt a wave of profound gratitude for those walls. They had been my prison, my battlefield, and ultimately my prize. But they were no longer my entire world. The car turned the corner and the building disappeared from view, swallowed by the rising towers of the new city. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes. I listened to the hum of the engine and the distant, melodic chaos of the streets. I thought about the future. I didn't have a plan beyond the next 7 days, and for the first time in my life, that was okay. I didn't need a map because I finally trusted my own internal compass. I had spent a decade being the anchor, and now I was the sail. I felt a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I thought about the coffee I would drink in Singapore, the people I would meet, and the silence I would enjoy in a room that didn't hold any secrets. I was free. I was whole. And I was just getting started.